Guys, happy Friday night, everyone. Welcome to the Simpademic. We made it into the week, folks. And I got a comment on my episode from last night, and I thought I would kind of deviate a little bit here and address the question. As usual, if you ask a question on one of my threads, it could be featured in an episode. So keep them coming. The question is, how did I wind up with my traumatic brain injury? And well, some of the foremost medical experts in the world still don't know the answer to that question. As I mentioned before, I live in Minnesota, and there was a situation in 2020 where my my TBI was actually caused by a freak brain infection, and I believe it was caused by the conditions in the apartment that I was in. I was not in as nice of a place back then as I was now. In fact, it was pretty rough. And one day I just wound up being incoherent, not talking, and my 19-year-old daughter actually arranged for help to come to me, and I wound up in the hospital in neuro ICU for 80 days. And it's a freak infection. It caused an excessive amount of fluid on my brain, and the short story is that my nurse practitioner said that I actually had a 60% chance of survival, but they told my family that I had a 30% chance of survival, which is typical in hospitals for them to do. And so I wound up in the neuro ICU for 80 days while they placed a shunt in my brain, and then also they needed to IV me with a large amount of antibiotics to get the infection under control and ultimately eliminated. And that situation left me, relatively uncoordinated, although I've got about 90% of my physical abilities back at this point. And so, yeah, that's the short story of it. My doctors at the hospital in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota, even tried to refer my particular case to doctors at the world famous Mayo Clinic, and they couldn't even answer the question either. And so that's the short story of how I got to that point. I have overcome many, many, many severe difficulties and trials in my life. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, that and the cult survival and the being raised by abusive and alcoholic parents, combination of things that have happened in my life means that any future woman in my life is going to have to at least be somewhere in the same ballpark. Because people who are complicated get less grace than pretty much anybody else out there. This was in a sermon at church a few weeks ago. And because we get less grace than anybody else, we're also capable of giving the most grace to people out there. And that particular dynamic, I think, is what any future woman of mine is going to be like. And we're going to just know. I'm not going to have to play around with these games. I'm still not going to have to be a simp. We will just simply know. And it's a very narrow category. If you want to accuse me of being picky, guilty as charged. Because I need somebody who's going to empathize and help with a lot of the traumatic incidents that I've had in my life. And vice versa. And I'm going to be capable of giving that grace to that future woman for the same reason. And you know what? You can call me guilty of being picky, but it's not picky in the case of most men and women out there. We're picky about things like, physical attractiveness, features, are they at 10? How much money do they make? In my situation, it's going to be about a lot deeper things than that. And I'm looking for a woman who has been through trauma close to my level. And because we have the gift of grace to give each other, that people who are complex simply don't understand. And so anyway, that's a story of how I wound up with a traumatic brain injury, neuro ICU for 80 days. I was pushed physically in the hospital. After having that kind of an infection, you wind up in a hospital bed after a while and you don't feel like moving. But I had a nurse staff that forced me to move. And I had one nurse in particular who I have a nickname for. And that nickname is Nurse Lombardi. I'm not going to mention her real name here, but Nurse Lombardi had me out on the floor walking several laps around the hospital wing every single day. Even when my body didn't feel like getting up or when I felt overly tired or super exhausted, which is the condition that this left me in. So, and she's called Nurse Lombardi because she is from Wisconsin and is a diehard Packers fan, and would, if I was watching a football game in my hospital room and the Packers were on, she'd be like, "Oh, time to have a patient check-in, you know. I need to check in on Jason, see how he's doing, you know." Quote unquote, how convenient. So anywho, that's my story. That's the response to that particular comment. Keep them coming. If you have any other follow-up questions, please put them in the comments below. Appreciate everybody who follows me. You folks have a good Friday night. Don't do anything stupid. Don't drink and drive. Call that Uber, call that cab. And you folks, enjoy your weekend. Peace out, homies.